Welcome everyone to the Matrix Conversations and Transformations. This is a seminar series from the Department of Critical Theory and Social Justice at Occidental College. I am Professor Caroline Heldman, the chair of the CTSJ department, and I am so happy to be joined by my co-organizers of this series, Professor Mary Christianakis and Professor Malik Mozam Dulat. I am also joined today by another colleague, Professor Kai Small, who will be co-hosting our very first event in the Black Women in Hollywood series. So we are very happy that you are with us today. A little bit about the series. This is a series that focuses on pressing current events. And the goal of the series is to connect our community with experts and scholars and activists and artists from across the globe. So as I said, the theme of this particular series is Black Women in Hollywood, and we will be speaking with folks inside the industry, from actors and directors and producers and executives to folks who are putting pressure on the industry, like researchers and activists. We're going to talk about why it is that Black women's representation in Hollywood, and especially in entertainment media, has been so persistent. Couple of things about the format. Please note that this is a webinar format, and that means that you can submit questions at any time through the Q&A button at the bottom of your screen. And it would be wonderful if you submitted questions throughout, and then we will address them at the end, but please feel free to submit them. Quick note about next Thursday, the second in the series, Black Women in Hollywood. We will be joined by actor and artist extraordinaire Lily Bernard. She is an Afro-Latina artist and activist. She has been an actor in Hollywood for 3 decades. She played Kramer's girlfriend, and we're going to be talking about the infamous blackface episode. We're also going to be talking about her experiences on The Cosby Show as Mrs. Manyfield. She is also a very public and vocal survivor against Bill Cosby and attended both of his trials. So we will be talking about all sorts of things pertaining to Hollywood next week. And now I want to turn it over to my colleague, Professor Kai Small, to introduce our very special guest today.
Hi, everyone. Welcome. Ninochka McTaggart's Ph.D. is a senior researcher at the Geena Davis Institute on gender and media, and she holds a Ph.D. in sociology from the University of California, Riverside. Her research interests include representations of racial and gender dynamics and stereotyping in mass media and popular culture. She served as guest curator of the exhibit Don't Believe the Hype, LA Asian Americans and Hip Hop at the Chinese American Museum in 2018. Her research has been featured on KPCC, KCET, CGTN America, and in the LA Weekly. Dr. McTaggart's latest book is White Privilege, The Persistence of Racial Hierarchy in a Culture of Denial. Welcome.
Dr. McTaggart, the screen is yours. You're going to be presenting some data, and then we will launch into some questions, Professor Small and I, and then we'll open it up to audience Q&A.
Wonderful. Thank you so much for having me. Let me just share my screen with everyone. Okay. Thank you for that introduction. I'm going to be speaking today about Black women in Hollywood, specifically focusing on stereotypes and tropes that we see in representations of Black women. Just a little bit more about myself. I'm a senior researcher at the Geena Davis Institute on Gender and Media. I've been in this position for about 4 years now. So I'm very excited to present some of the data that we've collected at the Institute today. So first I wanted to start with representations of Black women in Hollywood over time. So at the turn of the 20th century, we see that Black women were often portrayed as mammies, Jezebels, or sapphires. So the mammy stereotype entails a maternalistic Black woman, often of large body size, of an older age, who takes care of the children of her employer, usually a white family. She's nurturing, she's kind, she's wise, and most important, she's maternal. And we often see her taking care of other people's children and not her own children. So in this way, we're seeing that we're setting up the role for a Black woman as a caretaker for white children. So interestingly enough, the mammy trope was actually more popularized after Reconstruction. So we could argue that this is the case because slavery had ended and we still wanted to present a Black woman as someone who could be of service to white families. And here on the side, this picture is Hattie McDaniel in 1940, who won the Best Supporting Actress Oscar. She was the first Black woman to do so, and she won for her role as Mammy in Gone with the Wind. So she didn't even have a name, she was just called Mammy. We also see the Jezebel trope come up quite often. It's this idea that it's a woman who's promiscuous, amoral, hypersexual, is using her body and her sexuality to lure in white men. So it's the idea that we have these upstanding white men, and then the Jezebel comes in and she tricks them and lures them into sexual relations with her. So it's the idea, going back to the larger picture, of the Black stereotype that Blacks are animalistic, they're highly sexualized, they're primitive. So it's all reinforcing those tropes and stereotypes that we have for Black people overall. We also have the sapphire stereotype, which is a Black woman who is strong. She's sassy. She's emasculating to her partner. She kind of keeps the house in line. She doesn't take any flack from anyone. She's powerful, she's strong, all of these things. So I wanted to set this up because these are the foundations for the representations of Black women in Hollywood that we have for current time. So just want to make sure that I'm emphasizing that we don't have these stereotypes per se, present day, but they've basically just evolved and changed forms, but at their core and at their root, they're pretty similar to the representations of Black women we see today in Hollywood. So I just included some general stereotypes about Black women. They're often portrayed as violent, loud, aggressive, and sexualized. So first I'll start with an explanation of the strong Black woman. So we often see this portrayal in Hollywood. It's the idea that this person is almost like a superwoman. She can take on any task, she doesn't need help, she's independent, nothing can really harm her. And we actually see the roots of slavery in this stereotype as well. It's the idea that the stereotype that we see that Blacks are somehow, they can take, anything on because of slavery and be okay. And I wanted to mention here, why this is harmful, because we also see that, overall, Black women and Black men are less likely to seek treatment for mental health issues. So it's the idea that this stereotype has now leaked into other facets of society and are detrimental, I would argue. We also see the angry Black woman who is, can be prone to violence. She is, angry at everyone around her. She has a very hot temper, quick temper. And I just wanted to mention, we see this stereotype often in reality television nowadays. So it's the idea of the person who is ready to start a fight at any given moment, be violent against property, start an argument. So we're seeing that the roots of the Mammy, Jezebel, and Sappho are all the roots of these stereotypes today. We also have the hypersexual. A good example of this stereotype would be, women as objects, women's number one, I guess, aspect to focus on is their body and their sexuality and kind of what they can offer sexually to men. So from the Jezebel, we have the hypersexual now. So it's not only for the desire of white men, but now it's for the desire of men more broadly. We also have the welfare queen and the baby mama that I wanted to talk about a little bit more. The welfare queen came about in the 80s, most notably around the Reagan era. And it's this idea of this Black woman with many children who is abusing basically public assistance and living the life on this public assistance. So I believe Reagan said something about like this woman driving around in a Cadillac, and buying designer clothes with money that was given to her by the government. So this has transformed, I think, in the decades since then to the baby mama. So it's the idea, again, that Black women are hypersexual. They can't control their sexuality, so they're always having babies, they're always pregnant, and that's kind of their main purposes in life is to, reproduce in a way. So I just also want to emphasize here that all of these tropes and stereotypes are very detrimental. As you can see, most of these are negative, right? So it's the idea that, we want to explore and see how these stereotypes have evolved and where they stand today. So I wanted to talk a little bit about representations of Black women in Hollywood. So I wanted to start with what is the impact of all of these stereotypes and tropes and how are they harmful? So I want to point out that media is very impactful, right? It's the idea that we consume media quite often, and the more we consume media, the more we believe that these images that we see on the screen are actual reality. So we see people who consume more media starting to believe and buy into these stereotypes and tropes. And if you think about it, if you don't know, let's say, a Black woman in reality, what are you relying on your basis of what you conceptualize a Black woman as? So you go to the movies, you see TV. So these can be very harmful. So I wanted to talk a little bit about controlling images. So these are images designed to make things like sexism, racism, poverty, and other types of social injustice appear to be inevitable, natural, and normalized parts of our everyday life. So since we have these controlling images, it's kind of a framework for how we understand the world, a framework to also rationalize the fact that certain communities suffer oppression. And these images frame this reference for us. We also have symbolic annihilation. This is damage caused by the absence or stifling of a multitude of narratives. So again, why these stereotypes and tropes are dangerous is because if we're stifling a multitude of narratives, we're not getting the whole picture. We're not representing all voices in society. And it's dangerous because we do get locked into the cycle of tropes and stereotypes. And we've seen that we are progressing, right? There is more diversity and inclusion on the screen, but we have been historically prone to this idea of symbolic annihilation, where certain groups are just erased from the screen completely. So why are we doing this? Why is this research needed? Why is it important? You know, we have had a lot more representation of women of color and marginalized communities in TV and film, but we still have a long way to go. We still need more improvement. Research is needed just because hopefully research can serve as a tool for activism, for change, for more inclusion and diversity. There's so much more to go. And I believe research is a key avenue in getting us there and getting us informed about the state of representation in the media. So this is why we need in-depth research played by Black women, not just the presence of Black women. So I'll emphasize this many times, but the idea that there are roles for Black women is not the end-all be-all. We need to look at the types of roles that they're playing. So if Black women are playing roles that are stereotypical or, you know, categorize them as something negative, we need to see a diversity of roles. So it's important that the representations themselves are not just there, but that the representations are also more positive and less stereotypical. So because of this, we need new representation and inclusion standards. The ones that have served us up to now have helped with progress, but we need new standards as we progress and there are more changes made. So I wanted to mention here a development that actually came about earlier this week, I believe 2 days ago, from the Academy. So we look at the Oscars, it's like the top award in Hollywood. They've been making some great changes in that organization in the past few years after the Oscars So White movement. So beginning in 2016, we see change up to now in 2020, where they have successfully doubled the number of women and people of color in the Academy. And by 2024, they're going to make some substantive changes to how we decide who is nominated for the Best Picture category. So there's inclusion not only of racial and ethnic minorities, but other underrepresented identities like members of the LGBTQ+ community, those with cognitive and physical disabilities, those who are deaf and hard of hearing. Those communities are also included here. So these new inclusions, I'll just go briefly into them, but they have to do with who's telling the story. So who are the leads and who are also the characters being shown. It also has to do with execs at these companies that are making the movie to make sure that senior members of these studios are also people of color or from underrepresented communities. We also see that we want marketing teams and teams that deal with bringing an audience in to also be diverse. So there's some of the few rules that will be instated by 2024. Again, this is just for the best picture category. So hopefully there'll be a standard for all categories one day. So I wanted to show you a little bit about what we do at the Geena Davis Institute on Gender and Media. As I said, I've been lucky enough to work for them for over 4 years now and be a part of many studies where we are pushing for more diversity and inclusion. So we're not only looking at race in our research, but we also look at things like identities like disability, age, being a member of the LGBTQ+ community, and body size as well. So we're focusing today on Black women in Hollywood, but just want to let you know that we also do work, intersectional work on varying levels of identity. So also one thing to mention about the Institute is we also work with studios and people in the media industry to use our research in order to affect change in the industry. So we're not just, putting out these reports, but also trying to affect change in what we see on the screen. So the data that I'm going to share today comes from two of our most recent reports, our CJane TV and film studies. These entailed expert human coding, which I was also a part of the coding team on these studies. We analyzed almost 3,000 characters in the top 100 family films, and we define family films as those rated G through PG-13. We also analyzed 4,631 characters in the top 50 most watched children's TV show. So we had 25 children's TV shows for ages 2 through 6, and then our other 25 came from television shows catered to children ages 7 through 13. So a quick note about also, we have an automated coding tool called the GDIQ, which we're really proud of, sponsored by google.org, which was developed by the Institute and a team of engineers at USC. So this tool is revolutionary in the way that it can do an automated analysis of screen time and speaking time. So things that expert human coding might miss, we are developing this tool that can capture those things. And also, you know, we want to use this as a tool that people in the media can have access to, so they can evaluate themselves and how they're doing as far as diversity. So right now I'll jump into the findings. So we have, we see that as a baseline that Black girls and women comprise about 7% of the US population. We see that 7% of film characters are Black and female, versus 3% of television characters are Black and female. So we see with film, Black women and girls seem to be pretty on par with their population. However, we see that in television, Black women roles and characters are severely underrepresented. So for this study, I'm going to focus, turn my attention mainly on film. So I'll give you some data that we found in those two CJane studies. So as far as Black female leads, we see the percentage of the top 100 family films. So we see Black female leads at 10%. So that's a good sign because they are 7% of the population. We see for white female leads, they're 31% of the population and 33% of of female leads. So we see both Black and white women are slightly overrepresented. However, we see that other female leads of color come in at 1.8%. However, we know that Latinx, Asian, Middle Eastern, Indigenous, and Southeast Asian women are 14.3% of the population. So here again, we see for other women of color, there's still much work to be done and they're severely underrepresented. So I wanted to move into some of the data, the intersectional data that we do at the Institute. So here I wanted to present some data about Black women shown or women shown in STEM professions. So Black women come in at about 8.9%. So let me just note that this is of Black women that are represented, 8.9% of them are represented as having professions in STEM. So 6.7% of other women of color have STEM professions and 8.9% of white women are represented in STEM professions. So you see white women and Black women here come in the exact same rate, and other women of color fall a little short of those, that rate of 8.9%. So another attribute that we looked at is how are characters shown? Are they shown as intelligent or not intelligent? We see that similar levels for white women and Black women. So Black women come at 43.3%, as white women come in as 41.6%. So this is actually positive because according to our data, we see Black women are shown slightly more as intelligent than white women. And we see that women of color, other women of color, come in at 46.4%. So I was thinking, we could think about, the complexities with all of the data that I am presenting, but other women of color actually come out on top here. Next, we have the attribute of attractiveness. So we see that Black women out of these three categories are shown as attractive the most. And then other women of color are shown as attractive at the lowest rates. Again, this might be, if we analyze the data, this is a kind of a complex finding because are Black women just, shown as attractive because maybe of hypersexual roles? So we can obviously delve more into that. But again, with all of this data, it is complicated as, we are complex creatures. So next I wanted to jump into leadership, which was another attribute we analyzed. And there are promising results here because we see that Black women come in as 54.6% of Black women featured come in as, or are shown as leaders, as opposed to white women who at 47.3% are shown as leaders. So the numbers are pretty similar there. So that's a promising thing. Almost on par, Black women are almost on par as white women. And other women of color we see fall short at 30.4%. So we also analyzed how often women were shown as being criminal. So we see that other women of color are actually shown as criminal at higher rates than Black women and white women. And Black women are actually shown as criminal, it looks like, the least amount here. So that's surprising because we know that also a stereotype about Black people and also other people of color are that we are criminals or violent in some way. So this could be a promising data point here. So as far as occupation goes, we see that Black women that are shown with no occupation is actually the highest rate when we compare other groups of women. So we see Black women at 27.8% versus 23.5% of white women and 25% of other women of color. So again, this is not a more negative finding. So Black women are less likely to be shown with an occupation. So also you can see stereotype and tropes of Black people come in here where sometimes Black people are stereotyped as being lazy. So this, I don't know, could possibly be a response to that. And so let's talk a little bit about class and the analysis we did with that. We see that white women are much more likely to be shown as upper class when compared to Black women and other women of color. And again, this could be, the stereotype that people of color only live in poverty, right? So when we see people of color on the screen, they're living in, urban areas, they're living in projects. That's a very common scenario we see. So we're not really seeing Black women and other women of color shown as upper class. So that's also an issue we have to think about. How are Black women being represented? And how are these stereotypes at play? So when we also look at the attribute of violence or being shown as violence, we see that Black women surpass all the other groups at 35.6%. So it's the idea that Black women are, it goes together with that angry Black woman trope. So the idea that Black women are somehow more hot-tempered, short-tempered, and this can turn into violent actions. And we see that actually other women of color actually come in last here, and white women come in at 29.5%. So if we look at sexual objectification as an aspect or identity, we see that 22.2% of Black women are shown as sexually objectified, and white women and other women of color have lower percentages here. So again, this ties into the idea of hypersexuality of Black women, the idea that Black women are portrayed as something that is an object or something that is sexually appealing, and that their main identity or main characteristic about themselves has to be tied in with their sexuality or what they can offer sexually. So this kind of supports that trope here. So we have this graph about intersectional representation. So it's the percentage of Black female characters who are. So I told you about the 7% of Black women and girls that comprise the US population. But now let's talk about more intersectional identities. So we see that 11.5% of Black female characters are ages 50 plus. And just to give you a reference point, people ages 50 plus are 34% of the US population. We see that only 1.8% of Black female characters are LGBTQ plus, versus 4% of the population that they comprise. Just a little under 1% are shown having disabilities, when people with disabilities actually make up almost 20% of the population. And Black female characters are represented as having large body types 11.8% of the time, versus the 40% of the US population they comprise. So this slide is basically to show that these intersectional identities with Black females are largely underrepresented. So it's the idea that we do have Black female characters represented, but the question to be asked is, how are they represented? So the idea that we're not seeing older Black female characters, we're not seeing queer Black female characters, or characters with disabilities or of large body types. So, you know, in doing research like this, we're really interested in, you know, getting into the intersectional nature of the characters represented. That's very important. So I wanted to end on this last slide. It is a quote from Viola Davis from 2015 in Entertainment Weekly. So she said that as soon as a character of color is introduced in the story, imagination stops. And it's the idea that, you know, we need to research these nuances and complexities of characters, because oftentimes when we see characters of color, we're only seeing the very surface level. We're not seeing, and we're not seeing a diverse representation in that. So it's the idea that we really need to focus on making characters, and in this case, Black female characters, develop them more in our storylines, and give them that same background story and complexity that we see with many white characters. So again, our work at the Institute is great because we are looking at those complexities, we're looking at those nuances, and that's really important because simply being on the screen is only the first part of things, and we really need to delve into how Black women and all characters are being represented. So it's important that we do research and use this research as a tool for activism and change in Hollywood.
Dr. McTaggart,
That's it.
thank you so much for that wealth of data and for that historical context. Yay, thank you, thank you. So I have the honor of asking the first question, and folks should definitely post questions in the chat or Q&A if you want to ask questions of Dr. McTaggart directly. But the first question is, in really responding to this Toni Morrison quote, right, about imagination going out the window. What would you imagine for Black women's representation? How would you like to see Black women represented in Hollywood and entertainment media? And are there any films, movies, TV shows, video games, ads, any types of media that do some of the work you would like to see?
Yeah, that's a great question. I think how I would want to see Black women represented, I think moving away from these tropes and stereotypes would be the first step. So the idea of seeing more women in, again, like STEM fields like we looked at, we know that women are underrepresented generally, but also Black women. I would see, intelligence be a key aspect. Also, just not being seen as an object, which often a lot of these stereotypes and tropes forward for Black women. Also leadership, which was something I presented, but that's also promising. Black women as leaders would be great. And again, like the mission of the Institute is like, if she can see it, she can be it. So the idea that we really have to take into account what we're representing, because people are watching at all times. And if we have the representation there, I think that's a powerful tool. So just more, I guess, in short, more powerful, intelligent, strong Black women. And to answer your point about your question about what I think like programming that's doing great work in this area. Well, what comes to mind is I think a lot of the streaming sites are actually doing a great job with this. So I think that they're going to be, I guess, our avenue for more audience-driven content. So we see on the streaming sites, we see more diversity, we see more people of color and leads. So I think that might be a good place to start with more diverse casts.
Thank you.
Hi, so I wanted to ask a question about thinking about the impact and power of the circulation in media in shaping perceptions. And I'm thinking about this in two different ways that I would be interested in how you're thinking about it and how it's impacting the research that you're doing. One, thinking about how tropes are not just about representation in some of the ways people think about it as happening only on the screen, but are actually sites of violence and rationalizations for the distribution of violence in Black people's lives. And then also thinking about the impact of, in response to particularly Black women trying to negotiate the overwhelming presence of violent tropes that have defined Black femininity, in countless different ways, the difficulties of negotiating and the violences of negotiating respectability politics and the impact that policing representations can have while trying to avoid tropes that confines Black women's expression of anger or sexuality or desire. So I'm wondering how you're thinking about some of these impacts in your research and in your work.
Okay, so maybe first I can start with generally how, why we're doing this, why media is so impactful, and why these stereotypes and tropes are so impactful. So I'll start to say that, the more, it's been found that the more media we consume, the more we start to believe what we see on the screen is real. So when I say that when people have no contact with, let's say, people of color, or that they're using media as their avenue to that, which you can see with all these stereotyping is very harmful. It really, media molds the way we look at ourselves. It molds the way we look at other people. So it's really, really, really powerful. But that being said, I think the work we do at the Institute and the work I do on race is that media can also be an avenue for change. So it's the idea that we have, research and this type of data that we can influence who is writing the stories, who's being cast in the roles, who's behind the scenes, and what types of roles are being played. So I think that's kind of the important part, is to start there. As far as navigating what you talked about, like the violent stereotypes of Black women, how do we navigate that? That's a good question. I mean, these tropes and stereotypes have been around for a long time. As you can see from the Mammies, Jezebels, and Sapphires, it's the same thing. It's just put in a different box today with the angry Black woman and the strong Black woman. And I mean, I think it's very dangerous. We see that, Black women are not seeking mental health treatment. They're seeking mental health treatment at lower rates because people don't believe that they can, they can take it all. So people are afraid to go get help. So this is really, like, I just want to emphasize, really, really detrimental. I think what you said about the violence aspect, it's problematic because we see, like I said, on reality television especially, we see that trope over and over and over, right? The angry Black woman. And I think a lot of it, I would say, is, it's a power play. It's the idea that, for women overall too, it's the idea that, I would say, as far as gender dynamics go, that males still run supreme, whites run supreme over other communities. So, sorry, it's a long-winded answer, but I think the way to navigate that is, I think a start of it is just breaking down these stereotypes, bringing awareness to this, because I think if people don't know, like, oh, Black people are not all violent and lazy, then we're kind of stuck in a rut. So I think I would say we need to start doing things like this and research like this in order to first break those stereotypes down. And I mean, like you said about policing, it's like those officers are also watching TV and watching films and seeing these very negative representations and maybe rationalizing their behavior because they saw this. So again, I'm just trying to tie it into the idea that they're all connected, and they're all connected in, roots of white privilege. So we don't usually see, people talk about that with media, but I think that applies to media as well, as well as, criminal justice system, education, housing, etc. So I think we have to be real with ourselves and acknowledge that, this exists.
So we have an audience question, audience questions. Mira asked, how often are women of color positioned to play the role of Black women? Another question that's very similar. What is the frequency or number of roles available to women of color? Are roles highly limited? And I'll just add to that, what advice do you give for content creators so that there are more roles, so that there is better representation?
Well, I would say I don't have exact numbers, but I can tell you more generally that there is, like you said, underrepresentation, and what we saw from the data, even when people are in those roles, what types of aspects they have attributed to them. I would say for content creation, again, like the streaming services, they're seemingly promising for sharing stories of really intersectional stories. So the idea, I keep saying intersectionality, but it's so important because as people, we are intersectional people, right? I am not just a Black woman. Um, there's so much more about me. So I think the idea is to have more intersectional representation. So not solely a Black woman. I'm a Black queer woman. I'm a Black woman who is a police chief. I am, all of these things are important. So I would say for content creation, more stories driven by people of color, I think is going to change things. Again, also not only stories, but also who's behind the scenes, who's directing, things like that are also important. And then also who's running the studios. And we see a difference between TV and with streaming. We see streaming is very audience based, right? So the audience drives the demand. Whereas in our traditional TV studios, we see that usually white males are greenlighting projects. So I think we need a change all around in every aspect. Sorry, that's a simple answer of these things. Um, so I think stories by people of color, also more roles for people in color that don't necessarily have to do with being an actor and actress, but also behind the scenes as well, and in senior roles in companies as well.
So we were wondering if you could tell us about your life path and how you came to the work that you're doing now, and particularly how you came to use research as activism and a mode of bringing about and thinking about change in media and culture.
Well, if I'll talk about a little bit about how I came to, I guess, activism generally. My grandfather is actually a civil rights attorney, so I had that instilled in me from a young age to, fight for justice and fight for what's right. And also, I think going to predominantly white private schools, also, and being a child of immigrants from Jamaica, uh, just thinking about difference and thinking about equality was kind of entrenched in me very early on. And then as far as activism goes, I think once I was in college, I kind of realized and started studying sociology. I was like, oh, wow, like all these people are doing research and I'm reading the research now and all these students are reading the research and figuring out how powerful that was. Um, and then when I started my graduate studies, being a woman of color, I decided to focus on race and gender and popular culture because I felt that popular culture is not really seen oftentimes as something that's really impactful and powerful, but it absolutely is because it's so accessible to everyone, no matter what, socioeconomic background you come from, what region you come from, you can view media or listen to media. So I realized in grad school, mainly started using my voice as a scholar for activism. So I actually, to tell you a little bit more about myself, I studied Black and Asian relations in hip hop for my dissertation. So my idea there was to look at two racial groups that are stereotypically diametrically opposed and connect them in a way, intersectionally through race and gender, which was actually great because it led me to my experience as being a guest curator for an exhibit at the Chinese American Museum on that topic, which was great. And for me, I guess my role in activism is giving people a voice. So for me, for the hip hop exhibit I did was giving Asian Americans a voice and giving them representation, because we see, especially in Asian American communities, we see less representation overall in politics, in media, in all sorts of facets of life. So I realized after graduating and continuing to work with the Institute, that what I really liked about the Geena Davis Institute is that it was very different than my experience in academia, where we're actually doing data, right? Collecting data, writing reports that were accessible to everyone, because in academia, sometimes, we can be semi-insular. And for me, that was great because it was not only that we were putting research out there, but we were instituting change in Hollywood. We were doing, events, we're giving this research out, and we're making actionable change. So for me, that was really powerful. The fact that I could do research as an expert in race and gender, and then I can actually make change from it. So that was kind of a long-winded way of saying that was my motivation for this type of work.
Well, to follow up on that, Dr. McTaggart, we've received 2 questions that talk about your work with the Institute and about change in Hollywood more broadly. The first is they ask, I'm wondering if you can talk more about the parameters of the data that the Geena Davis Institute compiles, so what the process is. And then the topic you just brought up, how did you prepare and position yourself to do this type of work outside of academia? Though industries may seem open to the work/data that we as scholars can provide in this moment, the challenge of moving outside of the academy can be full of a number of challenges related to this and other topics. So lots to tackle there.
Yeah. Okay. So maybe I'll take the last question first, since it's on the same type thing, and then talk about the first question you mentioned. So yes, for me, coming from a PhD program, I had started working with the Institute before I graduated. So it was just a continuation. But for me, I kind of had to go through a struggle deciding whether or not I wanted to be in academia. But for me, there are challenges in academia for being a person of color. But I've actually found my experience outside of academia to be quite exciting and uplifting in my experience, because for me, it's important. The idea and the emphasis on representation for me is what I think drives me. And I wasn't feeling that so much in academia. So public research was kind of where I felt like I belonged more. And not to say there isn't challenges, but also what I really liked about our team at the Institute is we're female-led, and we are also extremely, diverse and inclusive. And that was a real plus to me, joining the team and feeling supported in that way. So that was just my personal story and journey to my work. And as far, I don't know if I answered your question, hopefully that helps a bit. And then for the other question that Dr. Hellman mentioned, the parameters of our research. So I can give you a basic idea of what we do. So our team we do a lot of media watching. So we basically, our main methodology on these studies is content analysis. So we watch like hours and hours and hours of TV and film. And we have a huge coding frame where we're coding every speaking character on a whole host of attributes, ranging from, sexuality and violence and occupation, some of the things I mentioned in the presentation earlier. And basically, we're just collecting data for every character. So you can imagine how much data we collect. And that's how we make our reports. And we have teams, the whole team is working on that. And it's pretty amazing when you think about it, because we just have tons of content analysis. And that's the way we can get such nuanced data, is because we are looking really, really delving deeply into the roles that people are playing in these types of media.
I had a question. If you were to look forward 10 years, do you envision a time when there will be more sort of Black-centered television, what that might look like? It seems to me, and I don't watch a lot of TV, but when I do, it seems to me like the availability of characters they're all tropes in some way. And so do you envision a moment, or are we in one now where Blackness is guiding those images, those characters, those formations of people?
Well, that's a great question. I think it all comes back to content creation. So the idea of who is making the content. So you can have a Black-led cast or cast with many people of color who are characters, but again, who is writing for that? So I think it's very different if you have people of color behind the scenes and people who are writing, versus if you have white people writing for characters of color. I think that to answer your question about in 10 years, what do I foresee? I mean, I feel like there is progression being made and getting out of some of those stereotyping. But we still have a long way to go. I mean, as far as the data, it just seems like there's a lot there. But if you think about it, these tropes and stereotypes have been entrenched in society at large for so long that, it's going to take a while to dismantle it. But I feel like the steps are there. And I think in 10 years, honestly, we will be closer. I think just want to mention very quickly that this time right now is very important, 2020. We're at a real time where social change is happening. So we have Black Lives Matters, we've had Me Too movement, we have COVID, right? So I think this time is really important, and I think this will fuel the change into, let's say, a decade from now, for people to wake up and realize that we have to accurately reflect what is out there in society, and that if people don't get on board, they're going to be left behind. So I think even if it's not driven from a moral standpoint or something where you just feel like, you want equality and justice for everyone, I think it will turn into something that is more money driven, right? So either way, I think people are moving to that, even if it might not be rooted in just justice for people. I think people will be left behind if they don't jump on this train of inclusion and diversity.
So Dr. McTaggart, we are out of time, and I just want to thank Ella, who also asked a very similar question. Professor Christianakis, not just in terms of your optimism for the future, right? Because that's what we want to do. We want to take action. We want to know what's coming next. And so we will be sending out recommendations for readings and for viewing that Dr. McTaggart will be putting together, has already put together. And we would like to thank our co-sponsors for the Black Women in Hollywood series, Gender, Women, and Sexuality Studies, as well as the Black Alumni Association. So can we all unmute just quickly and give Dr. McTaggart the clap that she deserves? Thank you so much for all of that rich data.
Thank you so much for having me.
It's a pleasure. Thank
Wonderful
you.
inaugural address. Thank you.
Okay. Stop
Bye,
it.
everyone.
Bye.